Welcome to the war narrative where wars become stories. The summer of 1940 was one of the biggest shocks in modern history. France, which had won the First World War, had one of the largest armies in Europe, and had hundreds of years of military tradition, collapsed in just 6 weeks. To people who saw it happen, the fall seemed almost impossible. Cities that had once stood proudly as centers of culture and power now lay open, vulnerable, and defeated. Soldiers marched into captivity with their rifles thrown away in ditches. Paris, the city of light, grew dark under the shadow of swastika flags hung from its old buildings. The world looked on in disbelief. How could the France of Verdun, the France that had fought so fiercely to stop the German attack in 1916, surrender so quickly to an enemy it had once defeated? The British newspapers scrambled for explanations. American observers watching nervously from across the Atlantic feared this collapse meant democracy in Europe was ending. To the Germans, meanwhile, it was a victory beyond what they expected. Hitler himself had prepared for a long, grinding campaign. Instead, victory had come with breathtaking speed. But the question remains, why? Why was France so fragile when facing the German assault? The easy answer often given is that the Germans outflanked the French by going through Belgium and the Ardennes, bypassing the mighty Maginot Line. But this is only part of the truth. Behind the shock of battlefield movements lay decades of decisions, beliefs, and failures that weakened France long before the German tanks ever rolled. To understand this collapse, we must first step back into the years following the First World War, a time when France seemed secure, yet was already planting the seeds of its future defeat. The armistice of 1918 left France victorious but exhausted. The war had been fought mostly on French soil, leaving behind a scarred landscape and an entire generation of young men buried beneath the earth. The survivors carried wounds, some visible and some hidden, that shaped how the nation would see the future. And here lies the first puzzle of France's downfall. It was not weakness of material that doomed the country, but weakness of imagination. The nation had soldiers, tanks, planes, and resources enough to fight. What it lacked was the ability to adapt, to see beyond the lessons of yesterday, and to prepare for the wars of tomorrow. This failure was not the fault of one man or one government. It was the result of an entire society that wanted peace so desperately that it blinded itself to danger. The League of Nations, praised as the guardian of global stability, offered the illusion that war could be banished forever. And France, having lost so much, was eager to believe. Politicians cut budgets. Military training was reduced. Officers left the army in large numbers. While Germany burned with resentment and plotted its return, France dozed under the comforting illusion that history's bloodiest conflict had truly been the war to end all wars. The irony is cruel. By believing peace was permanent, France made itself unready for the storm that would come. And when the storm finally broke in 1940, it swept away not only the French army but the myth of French invincibility, leaving behind the haunting image of a nation that had once been a giant, now fallen. The story of France's downfall in 1940 cannot be told without returning to 1918. On paper, France came out of the Great War as the victorious power. Its armies had stood shoulder to shoulder with Britain and eventually the United States to crush the German Empire. The Treaty of Versailles secured Alsace-Lorraine, imposed reparations, and seemed to confirm France's status as Europe's strongest nation. Yet beneath the surface, that victory hid a devastating truth. France had paid for victory with its very lifeblood. Nearly 1.4 million French soldiers were dead, and another 4 million were wounded. In some villages of the Somme and Champagne, entire generations of men were gone. The names on war memorials carved into stone columns outnumbered the living who gathered in their shadows. Economically, the war had left France nearly bankrupt, drained by the cost of rebuilding and staggering debt. Socially, the country was scarred by grief, haunted by rows of white crosses that seemed to stretch endlessly across the countryside. The army, once the pride of the Republic, also suffered from what people called a brain drain. Many of its most experienced officers, men who had survived the trenches and risen to command, retired or resigned. Some sought civilian lives after years in uniform. Others left disillusioned by a political system they distrusted. France's military tradition, so deeply rooted in centuries of kings and republics alike, now seemed hollowed out. This loss of talent might have been survivable if France had been willing to encourage innovation. But the mood of the nation was not to prepare for the next war. It was to prevent it at all costs. The League of Nations became a symbol of this longing. For many French citizens, especially those who had buried sons or fathers, the League represented not just international cooperation but a shield against future catastrophe. Why invest in new doctrines or advanced training when peace itself had supposedly been secured? Military service was gradually shortened. What had once been a rigorous 3 years of required training shrank to a single year, often more symbolic than serious. The army grew weaker, not because its men were cowards, but because the system that sustained them was deliberately softened. Politicians pointed to the fields of white crosses and declared, "Never again." The people believed them. Yet while France drifted into this complacency, Germany simmered with rage. The defeat of 1918 had not erased its ambitions. It had merely delayed them. By the early 1930s, while France still struggled to climb out of economic misery, Germany began to stir with new purpose under Adolf Hitler. Industry revived, roads and factories multiplied, armies trained in secret and then openly defied the treaty France had trusted to keep its old enemy shackled. French historian Paul-Marie de la Gorce later wrote that by 1936, the economic and financial situation of France had never been worse. This was not just a matter of numbers. It was a matter of spirit. As Germany surged upward, France seemed to sink deeper into exhaustion, its energies consumed by endless strikes, political deadlock, and the slow erosion of national confidence. And so, in the aftermath of the Great War, the seeds of the next disaster were planted. France had survived 1918, but in surviving, it had lost something essential: its belief in the need to be ready. The nation that once stared down the Kaiser's armies at Verdun now lulled itself to sleep, trusting treaties, allies, and good intentions to shield it from history's next storm. If the First World War drained France of blood, the decades that followed drained it of strength. By the mid-1920s, France was burdened with debts that seemed unpayable. The costs of rebuilding alone were staggering. Entire regions of the north and east had been reduced to ruins, their factories destroyed, railways torn up, farms poisoned by shellfire. To repair the damage required billions, but those billions were borrowed. France leaned heavily on foreign loans, especially from the United States, betting that German reparations would cover the shortfall. When those reparations faltered, France found itself saddled with crushing obligations. Then came the Great Depression. What little recovery France had achieved after the war collapsed in the early 1930s. Factories closed, banks failed, unemployment soared. The French franc wavered, foreign investors fled, and political leaders offered few solutions beyond austerity. Ordinary French citizens felt the decline in every aspect of life. Wages stagnated, savings evaporated, and strikes became common. The promise that peace would bring prosperity proved hollow. This economic weakness seeped into military readiness. Tanks, planes, and artillery required funding. Training new officers required funding. Building a modern war machine required funding. But the national treasury was too thin to sustain such ambitions. Budgets shrank, often cut by politicians desperate to keep the social order calm. The army was forced to make do with less, stretching its resources thinner every year. Meanwhile, across the Rhine, Germany was awakening. The Nazi regime, whatever its brutality, restored national industry at breakneck pace. New autobahns, new factories, new steel works. It seemed as though Germany had leaped a decade ahead overnight. By 1936, as French historian Paul-Marie de la Gorce observed, France's economy had never been worse, while Germany's had rarely been better. The contrast could not have been sharper. One nation descending, the other ascending. This imbalance carried deep political consequences. Once, France had been the senior partner in European diplomacy, the power to which smaller nations looked for protection. But with its economy crumbling, France could no longer project confidence. Allies like Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia, once drawn into French orbit by trade and security promises, began to hedge their bets. Why tie their fate to a weakening France when Germany appeared resurgent? To the French people themselves, the sense of decline was not just economic but cultural. The glow of victory in 1918 had long faded. In its place remained bitterness, disillusion, and the gnawing suspicion that the sacrifices of the Great War had been wasted. This collective fatigue spread through every layer of society. From the working class struggling to find jobs to the intellectuals debating whether democracy itself was doomed. The French army still drilled. The tricolor still waved. But behind the symbols, the Republic was a nation in slow-motion retreat, unable to restore its prosperity, unable to inspire its allies, and unable to summon the vitality required for another clash with Germany. In decline, France sought stability wherever it could, even if that meant clinging to illusions. The most costly of those illusions was yet to come. As France's economy stumbled, its politics descended into paralysis. The nation was governed under the Third Republic, a system notorious for fragile coalitions and cabinets that rose and fell with dizzying frequency. In the 1930s, France cycled through governments almost yearly, each one too weak to make decisive reforms. Stability seemed like a distant memory. At the heart of this turmoil was a widening divide. On one side stood the Popular Front, a left-wing alliance of socialists, communists, and trade unionists promising social reforms and workers' rights. On the other side stood conservatives and centrists, fearful that the left intended to tear down traditional order. The clash between these camps was more than political. It was existential. Each side viewed the other not merely as rivals but as potential enemies of the Republic itself. This poisonous rivalry bled into the military. Politicians from both camps feared that if their opponents gained influence within the officer corps, the army could be turned into a weapon of domestic politics. To prevent this, every appointment became a battlefield. Promotions were awarded less on skill than on loyalty. A general's political reliability mattered more than his ability to command in war. In effect, the French military became a prize to be divided among factions rather than an institution built to fight a foreign enemy. For the officers themselves, this was demoralizing. Many veterans of the First World War, men who had endured Verdun and the Marne, found themselves sidelined because they did not fit neatly into political categories. Some who might have offered innovation and fresh thinking left in frustration. Those who remained often kept their heads down, careful not to risk their careers by challenging doctrine. The very men who might have pushed France toward modern methods of warfare were silenced by fear of politics. This dysfunction was not unique to France. Every democracy must balance civilian authority and military autonomy. But in France of the 1930s, the balance was shattered. Civilian ministers micromanaged the army to protect their own party interests, while generals quietly fumed at being treated like pawns. The result was an officer corps stripped of initiative, chained by bureaucracy, and hesitant to take risks. The broader public sensed this weakness. Newspapers mocked politicians for endless bickering while crisis unfolded abroad. In 1936, Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland, a direct violation of the Versailles Treaty. The French army could have marched in and stopped him with ease, but the government hesitated, paralyzed by the fear of political backlash at home. The moment passed, and Germany's confidence grew. To the world, France appeared not as a leader but as a divided republic, unsure of itself and unable to act decisively. Thus, the political mess of the 1930s deepened the cracks already visible in France's armor. Economic weakness left the army underfunded. Political fighting left it leaderless. When the next storm gathered, the Republic would discover that an army built on loyalty to factions rather than loyalty to victory could not stand firm against the fury of modern war. By the late 1930s, the French army was less a meritocracy than a mirror of political anxiety. The system of promotion, once tied to battlefield service and years of command, had been quietly reshaped by the Third Republic's obsession with loyalty. The fear of civil unrest haunted the country. Governments feared that if ambitious generals leaned too far left or right, the army could be seized as a weapon in domestic politics. To prevent this, politicians preferred officers who were safe over those who were daring. The consequences were profound. Talented veterans, men forged in the trenches of 1914 to 1918, often saw their careers stall because they lacked the right political connections. Some retired early, bitter and disillusioned. Others remained but chose silence over innovation, unwilling to challenge outdated doctrine for fear of angering superiors. France did not lack soldiers or equipment. It lacked leaders willing to think boldly. This environment bred a culture of caution. Officers who might have championed the use of mechanized divisions or mobile warfare instead recited the accepted orthodoxy: defense first, offense later. To deviate from the script was to risk being branded unreliable. And so the French military hierarchy ossified, layer upon layer of bureaucracy and timid leadership. Historians later uncovered telling stories. A promising colonel who argued that tanks should be concentrated into independent armored divisions, a doctrine strikingly similar to what the Germans would perfect, found himself reassigned to desk work. Meanwhile, men with no combat brilliance but impeccable political credentials advanced steadily to positions of influence. The army that once produced commanders like Joffre and Foch now elevated bureaucrats in uniform. Ordinary soldiers could feel this difference. Training was often rigid, centered on memorization rather than improvisation. War games emphasized orderly maneuvers, not surprise or speed. A private might march past gleaming barracks and heavy artillery, but behind the shine lay indecision and fear of risk. The spirit of experimentation, so crucial for adapting to modern war, was smothered under layers of paperwork and political scrutiny. The irony was cruel. By seeking to prevent the army from being hijacked by extremists, France had weakened its own shield against extremism abroad. Loyalty was prized, but competence was sacrificed. And when the test came in 1940, that misplaced trust would cost France dearly. For centuries, France had been at the heart of European diplomacy. Its armies had marched across the continent. Its culture had defined refinement, and its alliances had once seemed unshakable. But by the 1930s, that aura of leadership was slipping away. France, once the hub around which smaller nations revolved, now looked tired, indecisive, and weak. The erosion of influence was not immediate but gradual. After the First World War, France had tried to construct a network of allies in Eastern Europe, the so-called Little Entente, with Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia. These nations, small but strategically vital, depended on French promises of security against German or Hungarian aggression. For a time, French officers trained their armies and French diplomats offered guarantees. Paris seemed indispensable. But as the 1930s wore on, those ties frayed. Czechoslovakia began to doubt whether France would truly risk another war to defend it. Romania and Yugoslavia, faced with growing German economic clout, shifted their trade toward Berlin. France's economic weakness made its markets less attractive, while Germany, rising from the Depression with astonishing speed, became the region's dominant buyer of raw materials. The balance of power tilted not through conquest but through contracts. Diplomatic hesitations only deepened the problem. When Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, France had every legal right and the military means to intervene. Yet Paris hesitated, paralyzed by domestic divisions and fear of escalation. The moment passed, and with it France's credibility. Allies watched carefully. If France would not act to defend its own treaty rights, would it truly act to defend them? The answer increasingly was no. By the time of the Munich crisis in 1938, Czechoslovakia's leaders knew the truth. French guarantees were paper promises. Under pressure from Britain and unwilling to stand alone, France accepted Hitler's terms. The betrayal at Munich sent shock waves through Prague. But it also confirmed what many across Europe already suspected: that France was no longer the pillar of resistance against German aggression but a partner in appeasement. This collapse of influence carried psychological weight as well. The French public, once accustomed to thinking of their nation as Europe's defender, now sensed that mantle slipping away. Newspapers fretted over declining prestige. Intellectuals debated whether France was still a great power or merely a shadow of one. Ordinary citizens reading of their allies drifting toward Germany felt isolation closing in like a tightening noose. Thus, when the storm finally broke in 1940, France faced not only a military challenge but a diplomatic one. It stood alone, its alliances weakened, its word doubted, its influence eroded. Where once Paris had spoken with the authority of a giant, now it whispered with the uncertainty of a nation unsure of its own strength. In the face of its own weakness, France sought reassurance not through bold strategy but through concrete and steel. If diplomacy could no longer guarantee security, perhaps fortifications could. Thus was born the Maginot Line, an engineering marvel, a monument to French caution, and ultimately a symbol of misplaced faith. Stretching along the Franco-German border, the Maginot Line was no ordinary set of defenses. It was a sprawling system of bunkers, underground railways, artillery emplacements, and fortified barracks. Some of its strong points resembled small cities buried beneath the earth, with kitchens, hospitals, and air filtration systems designed to withstand chemical attacks. To the French public, still haunted by the horrors of trench warfare, it seemed the perfect answer. A wall that would ensure no German soldier could ever again cross into French soil uninvited. Politicians hailed it as a masterpiece of modern defense. Engineers marveled at its sophistication. School children were told it was impenetrable, a shield that guaranteed peace. To many, the Maginot Line was more than a fortification. It was a psychological balm, soothing the trauma of the Great War. The very name became shorthand for security, as if France had built a physical embodiment of the phrase, "never again." Yet even at its conception, doubts lingered. Some generals worried that France was spending billions to defend the wrong frontier. The line covered only the direct German border, leaving the Ardennes forest and the Belgian frontier far less protected. But advocates dismissed such concerns. The Ardennes, they insisted, was too dense, too rugged, too difficult for modern armies to cross. As for Belgium, it was assumed that in the event of war, French forces would march north to meet the Germans there. The Maginot Line, they argued, need only protect the heartland. But in reality, the line revealed more than it concealed. It was less a sign of strength than of fear, a defensive monument built by a nation unwilling to confront the possibility of offensive war. Where Germany invested in mobile divisions, fast tanks, and innovative doctrines, France poured its dwindling resources into concrete. The difference was not just material but philosophical. Germany prepared to move. France prepared to stand still. Still, for the ordinary French citizen of the 1930s, the Maginot Line was a comfort. Walking through the streets of Paris, one could imagine that a vast wall of steel and stone now guarded the Republic. Farmers in Lorraine took pride in knowing that beneath their fields lay fortresses designed to halt any invasion. Veterans of Verdun saw it as the final resting place of their nightmares, a guarantee that their children would never endure the hell they had faced. The irony was that this grand defensive wall, meant to safeguard France's future, would soon become a trap. Like a fortress built on sand, it gave an illusion of permanence where none existed. And when the German storm came, it would not strike where France was strongest but where it was blind. The Maginot Line was more than a wall of concrete and steel. It was a wall of illusion. French leaders, haunted by the bloodletting of 1914 to 1918, convinced themselves that fortifications alone could prevent another catastrophe. In truth, the line did not protect France from Germany. It protected France from facing the reality of modern war. Engineers and politicians boasted that it was impregnable, a phrase echoed in newspapers and parliamentary speeches. To the French public, weary of conflict, those words carried hope. They could believe that unlike their fathers who had bled at Verdun, their sons would be spared. The Maginot became a national myth, as untouchable as the Titanic had once been unsinkable. Yet just as the Titanic met an iceberg, the Maginot Line would face its own undoing. Its greatest weakness lay not in the strength of its walls but in the limits of imagination. The line stopped where French planners decided the Ardennes forest would serve as a natural barrier. Thick trees, winding rivers, and narrow roads made it seem impassable to tanks. General after general assured the government that no modern army could push armored divisions through such terrain. They were wrong. When German panzers roared through the Ardennes in May 1940, they did not find an impenetrable thicket. They found opportunity. French units stationed there were second-rate, under-equipped, and convinced the terrain itself would do the fighting for them. Within days, German armor had carved a path through the forest, pouring into the French rear where the Maginot Line could offer no help. In hindsight, the flaw seems obvious. But in the 1930s, the line gave France what it most desired: the comfort of believing itself safe. It was easier to place faith in steel and concrete than to grapple with the painful lessons of modern mechanized warfare. France's generals clung to the past, convinced that the slaughter of the First World War had proven the superiority of defensive warfare. They mistook static strength for true security. The Maginot Line was not useless. In fact, its fortresses held firm during the fighting of 1940, and German forces rarely attempted to breach it directly. But its real failure was psychological. It lulled France into a false sense of security, discouraging bold thinking and blinding the nation to the need for mobility, innovation, and flexibility. As one critic later remarked, the Maginot Line was a formidable barrier, not against Germany, but against French understanding of modern war. The Republic had armored itself against the wrong threat. And when the blow fell, it landed not on the walls of concrete but on the fragile illusions that those walls had nurtured. Behind the Maginot Line lay a deeper problem, a way of thinking. French military philosophy in the 1930s was not just defensive. It was stagnant. The lessons of the First World War had been burned into the minds of generals and politicians alike. Victory came through endurance, through holding ground, through sheer strength stretched across the front. This conviction shaped every decision France made in the years before the Second World War. To the French High Command, the horrors of Verdun and the Somme had proven one thing above all: that the battlefield was a grinding machine. Whoever possessed the stronger defensive position and the greater reserves of men and material would inevitably prevail. Mobility, surprise, speed. These seemed like luxuries, not necessities. What mattered was being stronger everywhere, all the time. Thus, France's doctrine focused on even distribution of power. Infantry divisions were spread thinly across the front. Artillery carefully allocated sector by sector. The army's goal was not to break through but to hold. Generals drilled their soldiers not for rapid assaults but for orderly deployments, calculated withdrawals, and steady resistance. In theory, this seemed logical. If France could avoid another disastrous offensive and instead let Germany exhaust itself, time would be on France's side. But this approach ignored how warfare itself had evolved. Across the Rhine, German generals were reinterpreting Clausewitz with fresh eyes. They studied the stalemates of 1914 to 1918 not as proof that defense was supreme, but as evidence that traditional offensives had been too slow, too predictable. The answer, they believed, was to concentrate force at a single decisive point. Mass tanks, motorized infantry, dive bombers, and artillery would all converge to smash open a hole in the line. Once the breach was made, speed would do the rest. French generals saw the same data, the same history, but reached the opposite conclusion. To them, dispersal of force was safety. To the Germans, concentration was power. When these two philosophies finally collided in 1940, the outcome was decided not merely by weapons but by imagination. There were voices in France who warned of this danger. Some junior officers urged experiments with armored divisions, arguing that tanks should be grouped into fast-moving spearheads rather than scattered piecemeal among infantry. Others suggested that the airplane, no longer just a reconnaissance tool, could become the decisive weapon of attack. But these voices were muffled by an officer corps that valued conformity over innovation. Tradition was safe, experimentation was risky, and in a military dominated by fear of political repercussions, few dared to take risks. In effect, France was preparing to fight the last war all over again, but with newer equipment. The German army, meanwhile, was preparing to fight the next war, one that France could barely imagine until it was too late. The roots of this doctrine lay in Germany's bitter memory of the First World War. To many German officers, the tragedy of 1914 to 1918 had been not that their army was weak, but that it had been slow, bogged down in trench warfare. They remembered the endless artillery barrages, the mud, the attrition. They vowed that next time Germany would not crawl, it would strike like lightning. To make this possible, German planners broke away from the old formula of spreading strength evenly. Instead, they believed in massing force at a single point. Tanks were not to be wasted as auxiliaries to infantry but unleashed as independent divisions supported by motorized troops, artillery, and above all, aircraft. Dive bombers like the Ju-87 Stuka would scream overhead, sowing terror and chaos. Radios installed in every tank allowed commanders to adapt in real time, giving the German army an agility that the French, with their reliance on signal flags and field phones, could not match. It was not just technology, it was philosophy. The Germans embraced tempo. War, in their eyes, was not simply about strength but about speed. If you could disorient your enemy, force him to react rather than plan, his larger numbers and stronger defenses would count for nothing. The battlefield became a chessboard where momentum was more decisive than pieces. When German officers looked across the border, they saw an opponent still anchored in the past. French armies stretched themselves evenly across the front, convinced they must be strong everywhere. To the Germans, this was an invitation. Why attack strength with strength when one could shatter weakness with concentrated fury? The concept was not without risk. A failed breakthrough would leave German divisions overextended, vulnerable to counterattack. But the high command was willing to gamble. In their eyes, the French system, rigid and bureaucratic, could never respond quickly enough. Boldness would be rewarded. And so in May 1940, when German panzers smashed through the Ardennes and surged across France, the theory was put to the test. Columns of tanks moved with breathtaking speed. Infantry followed in trucks, and Stukas dived from the skies, blasting crossroads and rail lines to paralyze French response. It was not simply an attack. It was a storm, sudden and unstoppable, a living demonstration of the philosophy that war belonged to those who could move faster and strike harder. For France, the experience was bewildering. Battles that were supposed to last weeks collapsed in days. Defenses meticulously prepared were bypassed in hours. Generals accustomed to slow-moving fronts found themselves overwhelmed by reports of German armor appearing where it could not possibly be. This was the return of movement to European warfare, the return of speed, shock, and maneuver. And in the face of the Blitz, France's philosophy of static warfare looked not just outdated but fatally naive. If military philosophy shaped the course of the war, technology provided the tools. On paper, France seemed well prepared. Its arsenal included some of the most formidable tanks of the age. The Char B-1 heavy tank, with thick armor and powerful guns, could shrug off German shells when hit from the front. The Somua S-35, a medium tank, combined mobility with durability, outclassing most panzer models in protection and firepower. French infantry divisions were well-equipped, and contrary to popular myth, France actually fielded more motorized units than Germany. Measured by numbers and specifications, France's armed forces should have been more than a match for the Wehrmacht. And yet these advantages failed to translate into victory. The reasons lay not in the machines themselves but in how they were used. German tanks, while lighter and less armored, were deployed in concentrated armored divisions designed for speed and coordination. French tanks, by contrast, were dispersed in smaller groups, parceled out to infantry units to serve as support rather than spearheads. This fragmentation meant that superior machines could rarely fight as a decisive force. A Char B-1 might dominate in a duel, but a handful of panzers supported by aircraft and artillery could outmaneuver and overwhelm it. Technology alone was not enough. The Germans integrated their machines into a doctrine of movement, whereas the French treated their machines as isolated assets. It was the difference between an orchestra playing in harmony and individual musicians performing separately, each skilled, but out of sync. There was another crucial edge: communication. German tanks carried radios, giving commanders the ability to coordinate attacks, shift directions, and exploit openings within moments. French tanks, astonishingly, often relied on hand signals, flags, or even couriers on motorcycles. In the chaos of combat, this was a fatal handicap. A French armored column might wait minutes or hours for new orders, while German tank commanders adapted in seconds. The imbalance extended to the skies. France produced many capable aircraft, and French fighter pilots proved their skill by downing German planes at impressive ratios, sometimes 2-to-1. But production strength meant little without logistics. Spare parts were scarce, repairs slow, and damaged planes often sat idle on airfields while German squadrons replenished with speed. By sheer volume and coordination, the Luftwaffe seized control of the air, crippling France's ability to counterattack. Thus, the tragedy of French technology was not its inferiority but its mismanagement. France had the tools to fight but not the system to wield them. German tanks and planes were not necessarily better. They were better organized, better coordinated, and better imagined. In the end, the machines of war reflected the minds that commanded them. The French had strength but lacked vision. The Germans, though weaker on paper, fused technology and doctrine into a single weapon. And in 1940, that fusion proved devastating. If there was one detail that symbolized the gulf between German and French approaches to modern war, it was communication. In an age when speed meant survival, the Germans spoke in rapid, clear signals. The French, astonishingly, still spoke in silence and flags. Every German panzer rolled into battle with a radio. Even the lightest tanks carried sets that allowed commanders to coordinate movements in real time. Orders from headquarters could ripple instantly down to platoons in the field. If a road was blocked, if resistance stiffened, if a gap appeared in the enemy's lines, German units could react immediately. A column of armor could swerve, concentrate, or bypass obstacles almost as fluidly as cavalry once had in the open fields of Europe. The French, by contrast, treated radios as luxuries rather than necessities. Only command tanks carried them, and even then many were transmit-only sets, unable to receive instructions. Ordinary tanks relied on visual signals. Colored flags waved from hatches, semaphore-like gestures, or dispatch riders weaving through gunfire on motorcycles. It was a system that might have worked in 1916, but in 1940 it was disastrously outdated. On the battlefield, the difference was decisive. French armor, even when technically superior, often fought as isolated pockets. A squadron of Somme tanks could overwhelm German panzers in a head-on clash. But without communication, each unit fought its own small battle, blind to the movements of others. Coordination broke down, momentum was lost, and opportunities vanished. German commanders, meanwhile, exploited every hesitation. The problem extended beyond tanks. Infantry divisions relied on runners and telephones, lines that were quickly severed by artillery or air strikes. By the time fresh orders arrived, the situation at the front had already shifted. The French army, bound by bureaucracy and sluggish communication, could never match the tempo of a German offensive that moved like a living current. French soldiers themselves sensed the futility. Memoirs recall the frustration of watching German columns appear suddenly on flanks where they should not have been, as if the enemy had outwitted space itself. In truth, it was not sorcery but technology. Radios relaying positions, aircraft spotting ahead, units turning on a word of command. This was the hidden engine of Blitzkrieg. Not just tanks, not just planes, but voices carried over wires, weaving disparate elements into a single cohesive strike. France's reliance on flags and couriers could not keep pace with lightning. Thus, a simple detail, a piece of equipment no bigger than a soldier's pack, helped determine the fate of nations. France fought bravely but in fragments. Germany fought as one. And in modern war, unity of action proved more lethal than any single machine. If battles on the ground revealed France's sluggish doctrine, the struggle in the skies showed another fatal imbalance. The French Armée de l'Air was not without strength. It possessed skilled pilots, competitive aircraft, and factories that could produce machines in significant numbers. Yet when the clash came in 1940, the Luftwaffe seized control of the skies with brutal efficiency. The reasons were not as simple as numbers alone. In fact, French aircraft often outperformed their German counterparts. Fighters like the Dwoitin D.520 could rival the famed Messerschmitt Bf 109 in speed and maneuverability, while French pilots routinely demonstrated courage and skill. In combat, German losses were high, 2 planes destroyed for every 1 French fighter lost. On an individual level, the French airmen were anything but inferior. But war is not decided by individual duels. It is decided by systems. And here Germany excelled where France faltered. The Luftwaffe was designed as an extension of ground operations, a flying arm of the Blitzkrieg. Bombers struck bridges, railways, and communication hubs ahead of advancing troops, while Stuka dive bombers screamed down on French positions to sow terror and confusion. Every German attack on land was amplified by synchronized strikes from the air. The French, by contrast, treated their air force as a separate entity. Coordination with ground units was minimal, often delayed by bureaucracy. Squadrons were dispersed across too many fronts, unable to concentrate their strength where it mattered most. And perhaps most crippling of all, logistics failed them. Spare parts were scarce, repairs slow, maintenance understaffed. Factories could build new planes, but damaged ones languished on airfields, grounded not by enemy fire but by shortages of bolts and engines. German air power, meanwhile, seemed endless. Luftwaffe crews could repair, refuel, and relaunch with astonishing speed, keeping squadrons in the sky while French planes sat idle. Control of the skies was not just about dominance above. It was about strangling the French ability to respond. Supply columns were bombed on the move. Refugee roads strafed from above. Bridges destroyed just as reinforcements approached. The French army was not simply fighting the enemy in front of them. They were fighting shadows and thunder from the sky. For civilians, the impact was devastating. Columns of refugees fleeing northward found themselves targeted by Stukas, their terrifying sirens designed to break morale before the bombs even fell. Panic spread faster than gunfire. Villages burned not from artillery but from air raids meant to disorient and demoralize. The war seemed to descend from the heavens themselves, inescapable and merciless. Thus, though French pilots often matched their German adversaries in courage and skill, they fought a losing battle. They were lions forced to hunt alone, while the Luftwaffe moved as a coordinated pack. And in the spring of 1940, that difference proved decisive. Control of the skies became control of the war. If there was one thread binding together France's struggles in 1940, it was this, a doctrine frozen in time. The French High Command had not forgotten the First World War. They had remembered it too well. Every strategy, every assumption, every investment was shaped by the shadow of Verdun. To them, the war had been proof that defense was supreme, that massed artillery and static fortifications could grind down any assault. The lesson they carried into the next conflict was not innovation but entrenchment. French generals clung to the concept of methodical battle, a war of careful preparation, slow advances, and overwhelming firepower. This approach discouraged improvisation. Orders were detailed, rigid, and expected to be followed precisely. Commanders in the field had little freedom to adapt once the battle began. The aim was to avoid chaos, but in doing so they strangled initiative. The memory of Verdun loomed large. For the French officer class, Verdun had been both nightmare and triumph. A place where France nearly bled to death, but also where it proved that endurance could defeat even the fiercest German onslaught. That endurance became doctrine. Better to absorb a blow and hold than to risk a reckless maneuver that might collapse the line. The tragedy was that the Germans had drawn the opposite conclusion. They looked at Verdun and saw the folly of frontal assaults, the need for speed, breakthrough, and surprise. This divergence shaped everything. German units trained for flexibility, encouraging junior officers to take initiative when opportunities appeared. French officers were trained to wait for orders from above. German commanders saw tanks and aircraft as the spearhead of modern war. French doctrine saw them as auxiliary tools to support infantry rather than lead it. There were French innovators who saw the danger. Generals like Charles de Gaulle argued for concentrated armored divisions free to maneuver independently. His proposals were ignored. His writings dismissed as unrealistic. In the atmosphere of the 1930s, bold ideas were unwelcome. France did not want visionaries. It wanted guardians of the past. Culturally, This conservatism was reinforced by society itself. The French people, weary of slaughter, favored policies that promised security over daring. Politicians rewarded generals who promised stability, not risk. Military orthodoxy became not just a doctrine but a comfort, a way of convincing the nation that the horrors of the last war would never return. And yet, when war did return, it came in a form the French had not prepared for. A doctrine stuck in the past left the Republic unable to face the speed and ferocity of the new age. France had the soldiers, the tanks, the planes, but it lacked the imagination to weave them into victory. The German invasion of France in May 1940 was not inevitable. It was a gamble. Hitler's generals knew their plan was audacious, even reckless. Rather than hurling their armies head-on into the strongest French defenses, they would stake everything on a thrust through the Ardennes, a region the French had dismissed as impassable to tanks. If the gamble failed, German forces would be trapped, cut off, and destroyed. But if it succeeded, France itself could collapse in weeks. The Ardennes was no gentle countryside. Its dense forests, narrow roads, and steep valleys seemed the last place to send armored divisions. French strategists, bound by old assumptions, believed that the terrain alone would protect them. They stationed only second-rate units there, reserve divisions of older men with outdated equipment. Elite French forces, by contrast, marched into Belgium, bracing for a replay of the First World War. Meanwhile, in the German camps, the panzers prepared for a march few believed possible. For days, endless columns of armor and trucks wound through the forest, their progress slowed by traffic jams so vast that a single bombing raid might have destroyed the entire operation. But French reconnaissance barely registered the danger. Reports of massed armor in the Ardennes were dismissed as exaggerations. The French command could not believe the Germans would take such a risk. On May 13, 1940, the gamble paid off. German units reached the Meuse River near Sedan. Here, French defenses were thin, their artillery too scattered to mount effective resistance. Supported by waves of Stuka dive bombers, German engineers built pontoon bridges under fire, and armored columns poured across. By nightfall, a breach had been made. The speed was astonishing. Within days, German spearheads surged westward, racing toward the English Channel. French and British armies that had advanced into Belgium suddenly found themselves encircled, their retreat routes severed. Entire divisions were caught in a trap that had been sprung not by superior numbers but by superior daring. The French high command reeled in disbelief. Reports arrived too quickly to be trusted. German tanks at Sedan, German tanks beyond the Meuse, German tanks deep in the French rear. Generals clung to the belief that this was merely a diversion, that the main assault would still come in Belgium. By the time they recognized the truth, the enemy was already behind them. For Germany, the Ardennes offensive was more than a military success. It was a psychological coup. It shattered the myth of French invulnerability and proved that the bold could topple the cautious. The very ground the French had trusted to protect them became the path of their undoing. The German gamble had been perilous, but fortune favored speed and imagination. France, chained to its doctrines, could not comprehend the scale of the disaster unfolding until it was far too late. The breakthrough at Sedan was more than a tactical victory. It was the crack that split the Republic apart. Once the German spearhead burst through the Meuse, the carefully arranged French defenses unraveled with frightening speed. Armies that had advanced confidently into Belgium suddenly found themselves threatened from behind. Retreat turned to rout and rout to collapse. In city after city, panic spread. Columns of refugees clogged the roads, mingling with retreating soldiers. Families fled with carts, bicycles, even wheelbarrows piled high with possessions. German bombers targeted the crowded highways, sowing terror from above. Survivors remembered the chaos vividly. Screaming children, abandoned cars, and the ever-present thunder of Stukas diving from the clouds. War was no longer confined to trenches or battlefields. It engulfed civilians in a tide of fear. French commanders struggled to respond, but the pace of events outstripped their ability to react. Orders issued in the morning were obsolete by nightfall. Units sent to plug gaps in the line arrived to find that the Germans had already bypassed them. One officer later described it as fighting an enemy who moved like water, flowing wherever we were weakest. By June, the German advance had become unstoppable. Paris, once thought impregnable behind the shield of the French army, lay exposed. On June 10th, the French government abandoned the capital, fleeing south to Bordeaux. The departure was more than strategic. It was symbolic. Parisians watched their leaders vanish even as German columns drew closer. On June 14th, the swastika flew over Paris. German troops marched through the Arc de Triomphe, their boots echoing across cobblestones that had once celebrated Napoleon's victories. The contrast was cruel. The city of light, cradle of revolutions and republics, was now paraded as a trophy of conquest. For ordinary French soldiers, the collapse was bewildering. Many had fought bravely in isolated battles, inflicting heavy losses. Yet those sacrifices felt meaningless as the army dissolved around them. Veterans of Verdun, men who had once endured the unendurable, were forced to lay down arms after only weeks of fighting. The humiliation cut deeper than defeat, felt like betrayal. On June 22, 1940, France signed an armistice with Germany in the same railway carriage at Compiègne where the Germans had accepted surrender in 1918. The symbolism was deliberate, a gesture of vengeance orchestrated by Hitler himself. As the ink dried, the world realized that one of Europe's greatest powers had fallen in little more than a month. The collapse was total. France, the giant of 1918, had capitulated not after years of struggle but after a campaign shorter than a summer season. The Republic was dismembered. Occupied in the north, divided in the south, its government fractured into exile and collaboration. The speed of the fall stunned the world. To Britain, it was a grim warning. To America, a signal that Europe's fate hung by a thread. To Germany, it was proof that boldness could rewrite history. But to the French themselves, it was a wound that would never fully heal. The collapse of 1940 was not just a military defeat. It was a revelation, brutal and undeniable. France had fallen not because it lacked tanks, planes, or brave soldiers, but because it lacked imagination. Its doctrines, its politics, and its institutions had been forged in the fires of the First World War. And when the next storm came, they were found wanting. Historians have long debated whether France could have resisted longer. The equipment was there. The numbers were not hopeless, and individual units often fought with extraordinary courage. At the River Meuse, at Gemblix, at Lille, French and British troops inflicted heavy casualties on German forces. Yet these moments of valor were swallowed by the greater tide of disorganization. The war was lost less on the battlefield than in the minds of those who directed it. What France lacked was adaptability. When confronted with the unexpected, panzers through the Ardennes, Stukas hammering bridges, radio-directed offensives, its leaders hesitated. They clung to the belief that these moves were diversions, that the real battle would resemble the one they had prepared for. That hesitation was fatal. As one observer later wrote, France lost not to German strength, but to German speed of thought. The defeat carried lessons far beyond the battlefield. It exposed the danger of believing in security rather than preparing for uncertainty. It showed that loyalty in command is worthless without competence, that technology is useless without doctrine, and that fortifications cannot shield a nation from the future. Above all, it proved that wars are won not only by weapons but by ideas. For the French people, the defeat was a psychic blow. The generation that had endured Verdun could not comprehend how their children's war had ended in weeks. Pride gave way to humiliation, confidence to despair. Some sought solace in collaboration, believing Germany's victory was permanent. Others chose resistance, determined that France's story was not yet finished. Outside France, the lesson was equally sobering. Britain understood that it now stood alone and that survival would depend not merely on courage but on rapid adaptation. In the United States, the fall of France shattered illusions that Europe could resist Hitler without American aid. To the world, the message was clear. The age of slow wars fought by entrenched armies in grinding attrition was over. The future belonged to those who could think faster, move faster, and strike without hesitation. France's defeat was not the end of its story, but it was the end of an era. The nation that had once been Europe's great power had been unmasked, still rich in history, but shackled by the ghosts of its past. And those ghosts, more than German tanks or planes, had been the true architects of 1940's disaster. The armistice of June 1940 left France divided, humiliated, and haunted. The once proud republic, the nation that had stood firm at Verdun and dictated terms at Versailles, now found itself carved apart by the conqueror it had once defeated. Northern France fell under direct German occupation. The South became the Vichy regime, nominally independent but in truth a puppet, its leaders collaborating with Hitler's new order. For the French people, the legacy of 1940 was one of trauma and soul-searching. Cities bore the marks of occupation. Swastikas draped across town halls, German patrols marching down boulevards, curfews imposed on once vibrant streets. To live in occupied France was to live with choices no citizen should have to make. Accommodation, collaboration, or resistance. Each choice carried risks. Each carved its own scars into the nation's memory. Yet even in defeat, France's spirit was not extinguished. In London, Charles de Gaulle declared that France has lost a battle, but not the war, rallying free French forces to continue the struggle abroad. In the shadows of occupied towns and villages, networks of resistance quietly formed. Men and women risking everything to sabotage rail lines, pass intelligence, and preserve dignity in the face of subjugation. The French collapse had been swift, but the fight for France's soul would stretch on for years. The aftermath also left deep wounds in Europe's balance of power. For Britain, France's fall was a stark warning. Even the greatest armies could crumble if chained to outdated ideas. For the United States, it was a signal that isolation could no longer shield them from the chaos across the Atlantic. And for Germany, it was intoxicating proof that audacity could redraw maps in weeks. Hitler believed himself unstoppable, an illusion that would soon drive him into even greater gambles. For France itself, 1940 remained a wound that never fully healed. In the decades that followed, historians and politicians alike searched for answers. Was the fall inevitable? Was it cowardice, poor leadership, or sheer bad luck? Each explanation carried blame, and each left lingering bitterness. But perhaps the truest answer was simpler. France had been prepared for yesterday's war, not tomorrow's. And in 1940, tomorrow arrived faster than anyone expected. The legacy of that defeat was not only national humiliation but national transformation. When France finally rose again in liberation, it did so with a new understanding of modern war. That courage alone was not enough, that adaptation mattered as much as strength, and that no wall of concrete could shield a nation from the future. Thus, the fall of France in 1940 remains more than a story of military collapse. It is a cautionary tale of complacency, of the dangers of clinging to the past while the world races ahead. A nation of giants was brought to its knees not by lack of weapons but by lack of vision. And in that truth lies the haunting legacy of one of history's swiftest and most shocking defeats.